Well, let's try and force an answer right now. Unfortunately, the gentleman has left, but seated right where the photographer is now seated in, as you will remember, there was a poor victim just sitting and watching a presentation this morning. And he was attacked by one of the presenters. I'm not going to name names, but he's seated on this stage. This presenter, after telling us that he was able to decode someone's risk in an insurance context, simply from a selfie, translating things like height, age, BMI, he proceeded to take out his telephone, locate someone nearby, and take a picture of this poor person who was too staggered and amazed to resist or concede or do anything at all. In fact, shell-shocked, he's run away from the conference.
I'm sure there was consent. Totally.
That's right where I wanted to go with the question. He did volunteer, didn't he? He said yes. You asked, and he said yes. What happened there?
Yeah, what happened? So, you know, one of the funny things was, I mentioned early on that we took 3,000 pictures of participants on that bike ride outside Bangkok. And one of my local colleagues came up to me and said, you know, all the people who are standing in line here, you know, they're all having the same conversation. And they're all talking about what kind of crazy stuff you guys are going to do with their pictures and their data. And they're still all standing there, right, volunteering to give their data and have their picture taken. And this is 3,000 people pretty much talking about the same thing, and all of them joking about what we're going to do with the data. I'm not sure whether we actually, I think we got them to sign something. Yeah, it's a funny one. And when does the joke kind of end, and when does it get really serious? I don't really have an answer to that. I guess, no, it's not true. I do kind of have an answer, something of an answer to that. When we, nobody, and what I mean by that is none of the regulators we've ever spoken to complains when we do stuff like, you know, experimenting. When it's small scale and when it's contained and when we're very open about what's happening. Where they do start to complain is when they think we're building it into products, and when that product then has the potential to do something to disadvantage certain customers. That's when they get very, very nervous. Give you a really stupid example. So one of the many stupid ideas I've had recently in the last 157 weeks since I joined the insurance industry, it was, you know, all this genetic testing stuff. Yeah. We should absolutely do that, but not to exclude people, but to proactively include people, and then force behavior change on them that will help minimize the risk and help us understand closer what's actually happening. So, you know, for instance, if you have the BRCA gene for breast cancer, which hopefully none of the four of us poor people have, so clearly you do more self-testing, maybe you take more mammograms or whatever it is, and we check that you do that. And every month you have to enter the outcome of your own self-test. And regulators are really, really nervous about this. And we're not actually, we don't want to do anything bad. But then there is there's sort of all sorts of agent problems, and you know, if you don't want to do anything bad, maybe you know, you fall asleep or whatever, and somebody else takes over, and they want to do something bad, or ultimately you can't keep organizations from doing something bad if something bad can be done. And then there's the other problem: what if what we think of as bad changes from today to tomorrow? Very true. But there was another subject too that you touched on, which is quite interesting, this idea of behavioral modification, the idea that we will use these tools to feedback and change the way people act. I actually have a quote, I'm not going to read it, but it's from the Geneva Institute, and they talk about AI insurance shifting from understand and protect to predict and prevent. Yes. And what they mean is that, or what they're trying to
imply is that they will be able to set up feedback loops with policyholders and elevate in certain moments, perhaps, risk measure by raising policy rates in order to nudge behavior. That is, in order to reduce risk on the part of policyholders, which makes a lot of sense, right? Policyholders now live more healthy lives, presumably. But the reason we get insurance in the first place is precisely the opposite, right? It's the reason we get insurance is so we can take chances. Like, I got health insurance, not so that I can be healthy. I'm already okay. I got health insurance so I could ride the double black diamond in Aspen, right? Because I knew if I broke both my legs, it would be paid for. What insurance is supposed to let you do is live a vital, adventurous life. But I'm worried about this now that you talk about behavioral modification, that if everything I do is being modified by the insurance brokers who are telling me, look, your risk is elevating because you're going on the double black diamond, we're going to raise your policy cost or take the green run, your choice. Right? I mean, isn't insurance taking away from life instead of helping life at that point?
No, and you've got it. That's exactly what it is, and that is exactly what we want to get to. And if I don't know what I can tell about your double black diamond run, but stuff that's more, in a sense, more subtle. I mean, that's sort of an extreme example. And I think obviously there is all sorts of risks that come up with that, and people. I don't remember how many. There's a ski resort that I go to outside Salzburg in Austria, and every ski season they go through 4 tons of plaster. That's just staggering. So these accidents clearly do happen. But I think what's more subtle and what I really want to attack is other bad behavior that you get to. And that's obviously smoking and drinking and all other elements of fun in life, not just skiing. But also stupid stuff like maybe I can help you cross the road at a slightly better point on your way to work every morning. And that shaves off a couple of micromodes of your risk on your daily commute or whatever it is. But those are the things that we do want to get to. And it's not mandatory. Maybe we flex your pricing or you flex your coverage or whatever it is. Or maybe there's obviously some residual risks that we do need to sign up for.
So I think that's interesting. It's, one of the things that we work on is looking at, it's not just that pastiche of laws, but it's these proposed regulatory frameworks for the ethics of AI. And a couple of them are pretty on point with this, which is this respect for human autonomy. It's one idea to say if you want to come and help me, you see me crossing the road, you're like, no, don't cross there, you're going to die. It's the Autobahn, for God's sake. Why don't you go to the crosswalk? You're going to die. Or if you see me on that black diamond, you're like, James, your skill is not to that level. But if you've got these autonomous programs working and they're using the Richard Thaler nudge effect, and we're predictable, we can change that behavior and we can price it. You can start to price that behavior out. Is that going to be allowed? And that's the question. Like, what kind of respect do we have on that philosophical level that's being embodied within these principles? So Montreal says respect for autonomy. The EC says principle of respect for human autonomy. They're thinking about this, and they're like, we don't want to let go of that. We don't want these machines saying, oh, we know what's best for you, so we're going to sanitize all the TV and you're never going to see it. Or we're going to stop you from seeing these images that are going to cause you PTSD, or whatever it is. You say, every step along that way seems okay, but where you end up may be very different than what we think of as like that human experience that in theory insurance is supposed to support. That vitality to life, as opposed to just the easiest things to do, that keeping us from quote unquote harm or doing something bad. I thought that was interesting. From my perspective, is something bad because it's illegal, or because we shouldn't do it, or because our norms and values today give us some descriptors of behavior?
I thought we might shift quickly. I know there are some technical people in the audience, to the question of explainability and whether or not people can actually understand what's going on inside, especially non-linear neural network, let's say, for example, non-linear kind of algorithmic processes, and whether or not people can understand, and how companies that are involved in these kinds of semi-black box constructions, how they respond to that on the level of the law or regulation or on the level of humanity.
I have a question for the room. Anybody here have friends who are convinced that their phones listen to them and suggest advertisements based on that? Come on, raise your hands. Anybody? I'm not saying you do, because you're not, you know better, but your friends. And they're convinced. They're convinced, and there have been regulatory inquiries about that. And you're like, I never said this, I never typed this in. It was just a discussion, or just looked at it in that shop window. How did they know? But then, if you're that organization, if it gets too good, if your predictive analytics get too good, then you almost have to prove the negative about certain things where people are convinced you had such an invasive presence, show me otherwise, or show the regulator otherwise. Again, under these regulatory regimes like GDPR and CCPA, there are private rights of action to demand things out of the organization. Instead of just assuming it's a black box as far as that corporate entity, you can write them. GDPR, you put in a DSAR, which is that data subject access request, 30 days. 30 days to get that information out. So on the back end, we're figuring out how to host that data to keep it off our system so we can search it and provide back what's asked for. But that's only going to get more complicated based on the type of consumer data that's there, the types of consent and all of that. So I don't know, Michael, I mean, do you see that? Do you see how everybody was smiling when you were getting the bicyclists, but you go further north to Hong Kong, and a lot of that data is being collected, and those guys were wearing the laser pointers on their faces to keep the facial recognition algorithms from tracking them and seeing what was going on. I think you look at the context here, and it's changing dramatically, pretty rapidly.
So on explainability, so the way I look at it, it has at the very least three, and I don't know about legal stuff or anything else, so I'll just give a techie answer if you don't mind. It has three different there's three different elements and my colleagues are hounding me about explainability all the time. And the only reason why they do that is because they understand their old deterministic and stochastic models really well, and they don't understand my models so well, so that's why they're saying, oh, it's not explainable. It's only because it's new that you don't understand what's actually happening underneath the lid or whatever it is. It just so happens that my model works better than your bad, wrong, deterministic model. So rant over. So there's three things. There's the choice of model. And there's kind of two extreme regimes. One where you have huge volumes and low impact of making a wrong decision. And then you have another extreme where you have lower volumes and a high impact of making the wrong decision. And obviously there's sort of all sorts of space in between those two extremes, but essentially when you have low impact of making the wrong decision, and that means that correlation is absolutely good enough. So no need to think about causation. Go knock yourself out with neural networks of any kind. In the other extreme, where you absolutely must understand causation, for whatever reason, be that a regulator or be that some other reason, go and build the type of model that actually gives you causal inferences, and that is things like probabilistic graphical models. And for all the stuff that sits in between, go and do the gradient boosting that wins you Kaggle competitions or whatever else. So the first element is about model choice. The second element is then about what we do with the models. And then we come to things like Shapley values and all these kind of things, so where we try and understand how do various parameters or inputs affect the outputs. And then the third element is all around the implementation of a model in reality. And that's when it comes to things like A/B testing that absolutely must do all the time. I think you can never understand, even if you have the best will in the world, even deterministic models, it's really hard to understand what's actually happening unless you have some element of A/B testing at the front end, where you see, okay, now I change things at the far down at the user end, and then I look at what's happening in the back. And those are things that, some of the stuff can be absolutely automated, the Shapley stuff, for sure. But a human needs to make a model choice, and other humans need to do the continuous testing. And those need to be reasonably smart and sort of AI proficient humans. But that's sort of my answer on explainability. absolutely, I understand for whatever reason you want to have some explanations as to what's happening in my model. I don't know why, but here, go and look at these tools and they will tell you what's going on.
And so if I heard you correctly, just very quickly, you do agree that there is an area, at least a single area, within artificial intelligence in which the idea of explainability, for lack of a better term, simply doesn't make sense because of the way the AI works in a nonlinear fashion, as opposed to a causality thought. In my world, we think, look, in order to understand something, just as a condition of the possibility, you need to think through causality. Human beings cannot understand reality, simply put, if we don't slap a causality frame on it. It's the way we're made. It doesn't mean we're bad people, but it's the way we're constructed. So I kind of want to push you a little bit on that one. Is it possible to imagine a black box AI, which, because it does not work through a causality, therefore is not explainable by definition?
No, because you can still do the Shapley values and you can still do the A/B testing. And then you have something else in your favor. So in a really reductionist point of view, you could say a first indication of causation is correlation combined with time. So in all honesty, even the most crazy 30-layer deep convolutional neural network, I can still give you some indications of causation.
If you have enough time to do it.
Yeah, if you really want it.
Right.
I want to pick up on that point.
I want to pick up on my point too, but you do it first.
Well, some of the things that we say, if you're at a point where it doesn't make sense to explore that idea of explicability, even if you've got like a transparency regime where you're going to expect it, the auditing on the back end can be a really powerful tool as well. To say, so, the concerns that we have and where you might expect to see a transparency inquiry is if you hit something that's important to regulators and kind of the public at large. If you have a model for insurance that's going to hit minorities in a disproportionate way, if you have any kind of disparate impact, same goes for like lending models, same thing goes for employment issues, that's where it's happening. And a lot of that's just, it's built from the data itself. You guys familiar with redlining? That's a big issue with mortgages. The best data you have on who's going to pay a mortgage comes from existing data, but it's just rife with so many decisions over the last century about who gets to live where, who pays what kind of mortgage. Same thing with automobile sales. Hiring, I mean, you train a model on what a CEO looks like in the United States, what's it going to tell you? Right? It's going to say, okay, it's this 50-plus-year-old white male that went to an Ivy League school. That doesn't mean that those are the only good candidates for CEO positions. And I think there's a real strong position here in the United States that we need to change that. But if you can audit on the back end and you say, if this is what we're hitting, this isn't the right result. It may be what the data is telling us. So we need to move, we'd call it like a modular computing approach. How can we change things? How can we start to tweak this process so it can get closer to the aspirational goals as opposed to just what a system's telling us?
And what you're touching on is actually sort of notions of fairness and all these kind of things. So, which are inherently really difficult to describe because as society we don't even agree as to what's fair. We have in this wonderful country two very different notions of fairness. You have fairness of the starting point in life and the fairness of your output, the outcome in life. You have an inherently Republican and a democratic view, if you want to take it on the top of fairness. And then maybe as a third view, you even have a libertarian point of view. We as humans don't even agree what's actually fair. And sometimes I find it a bit funny that we're expecting our models to define fairness or produce fairness automatically, even though as humans we don't actually really agree between us. We know we have different notions of what is fair. Is all this redlining, does it make sense? Is it fair? No, who cares? It's fair, it's illegal. Okay, let's not do stuff that's illegal. But then, let's not put too much on the model that needs to come out. The model is not going to be smarter than us humans, that's for sure.
Right, there's a problem. If we can't define fairness to begin with, then we can't recognize it when we see it.
Absolutely.
So we have no way of
you got to think about, I mean, even scraping Facebook data, these non-traditional data sources, you're like, all right, I'm going to exclude everybody who likes rap. Don't do that, okay? It's not really legal advice, you're not my clients, but be really careful when you think about those disparate impact issues, because that's where the government, and they are not going to be sympathetic. It doesn't matter if that's just what the data told you, and all of that may be true. I was at the DESI conference a couple years ago talking to some financial modelers, and they said we had this beautiful model that would have worked. $1 billion idea. We can't use it. We can't. We know it. We audited it on the back end. It's accurate as far as the data. It absolutely positively will work. It works too well.
Yeah. It's a good way to put it. Sometimes things work too well.
These are, if there's an unintentional, and sometimes there are ways in which gender really does matter. Clinical data trials have completely different restriction, because guess what, there you're like, we're not worried about fairness so much as someone being healthy or someone getting the care, and we know gender and we know age and we know height, weight, all of those things matter very much, and we just want the right delivery at the right time. Heck, you've got different rules for consent with clinical data trials. Even in countries like Europe, often you can withdraw consent, except there. Once you're in it, it matters too much. For governments, it may matter too much. You have higher goals in mind.
Well, I've been signaled by our wary staff member that we have come to the time for drinks and happiness. So I'd like to thank our panelists for a very engaging and interesting discussion.